My name is Sebastian North, and today I want to explore: are endurance athletes psychologically different from skill-based athletes, or do we just train differently? Why does one athlete choose 5 hours of controlled suffering, while another chooses 5,000 repetitions chasing a perfect swing? Why does one person feel alive inside discomfort, while another thrives inside precision? I'm an endurance athlete, and when I'm suffering, it means one of two things: I'm winning, or I'm losing. There's a difference. Good pain feels almost euphoric. You're on the limit, but it's clean, controlled, earned. Bad pain feels angry, heavy, like every early morning meant nothing. But here's what confuses me. In endurance sport, you actually learn not to suffer. You learn to regulate it, to distract yourself, to hold numbers instead of emotions. Sometimes you just switch off entirely. And strangely, I get more nervous playing tennis with my dad than I do racing for 4 hours at threshold on my bike. Because in a race, I know what to do. I've done the numbers 1,000 times. But in a technical sport, every movement is exposed, every mistake visible. So I started wondering, are endurance athletes wired differently? Or have we simply trained different psychological skills?
Are endurance athletes?
To look at this through an academic lens, I want to look at a 2016 paper titled Putting the Bumps in the Rocky Road, Optimizing the Pathway to Excellence by Professor David Collins and his colleagues, who argue that adversity alone does not create excellence. They challenge the popular notion that trauma builds champions. Instead, they suggest that what separates elite performers is not hardship they experience, but the psychological skills they bring to that hardship. Skills like self-regulation, coping, reflection, deliberate response to stress. In other words, it's not suffering that builds you, it's how you interpret and manage it. That complicates my entire argument, because if endurance athletes appear comfortable inside pain, maybe it isn't personality, maybe it's training. To explore that idea, I spoke to Professor David Collins of the University of Edinburgh. Dave, as he goes, has written more than 350 peer-reviewed publications and over 70 books and chapters. As a practitioner, he has worked with more than 80 world or Olympic medalists, professional teams, and performers. And before all of that, he served as a Royal Marine. I spoke to Dave about this question, whether endurance athletes are genuinely wired differently, or whether what looks like madness is really just trained psychological skill. And I pushed him specifically on his paper, Putting the Bumps in the Rocky Road, where he argues that it is not adversity itself that builds excellence, but the skills athletes bring to it. Here's what he had to say. Dave, in your Rocky Road paper, you push back against the idea that adversity alone builds elite performers, but could you explain why the challenge itself isn't enough?
There's a guy called Aldous Huxley, all right, famous drug addict, so absolutely perfect for sport. And he says experience is not what happens to a man; it's what he does with what happens to him. So this is the problem. Everybody thinks that if I work through trauma, I'll get better. Yeah? What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Well, there's two problems. The first one is it might kill you, which is really bad on your CV. But the other problem is that you might not learn from it. So it's not the fact that you go through a rocky road. It's the fact that someone sits down with you and debriefs that with you. All right. So that you learn the lessons from it. So the rocky road to success, why talent needs trauma, was our paper that said, if you look at people who've made it, they've been on a bumpy road. They've gone through moments of feeling really upset. And you know, their lack of success being really upsetting, but they've learned from that and they've worked through it. So pretty much where I'm coming from, Seb, is that anybody with an ambition, whether it's sport, music, dance, academics, whatever it is, anybody with ambition will go through some upset. In actual fact, where we are in our research at the minute, that upset is not only inevitable, I'm also suggesting it's desirable.
Interesting. And when we look across different sports, endurance versus technical, precision-based sports, do you see fundamentally different psychological profiles, or are the same core skills present, just expressed differently into their individual sports?
I think it's the second. I think there's a set of core skills. We've operationalized that as the psychological characteristics of developing excellence, or PCDEs, and we've done a lot of work with that. We've also done it in a lot of different countries as well. And pretty much there's these 10 skills that persistently and consistently are the things that people need to get to the top. Now, they're operationalized differently. In other words, they're applied differently. Yeah, PCDEs work in dance, but they look very, very different in a ballet dancer than they do in a shot putter. Yeah, but they're still there, right? So if you now look at an endurance athlete, the endurance athlete must train at the edge of a cliff. If they go too far, they fall over the edge of a cliff. They go sick. They go down. They lose training. If they're not training close enough to the edge of the cliff, they're not training at maximum output, and just to add to the fun, the edge of the cliff moves, depending on how you're feeling and what's going on. Now, for a golfer, that edge of the cliff represents 100 swings. For a cyclist, that edge of the cliff might represent 100 miles. But the focus and the desire and the drive to work through that is very similar. They're just focused on different things.
So when you think about the cultural narrative that endurance sports and people that partake in them are slightly mad because they choose suffering, from a scientific standpoint, do you believe there's evidence that certain personalities gravitate towards endurance sports? Or do you think it's sort of right place, right time when it comes to what sport you end up excelling, being incredible at? Do you think, say, if we're looking at golf, like Tiger Woods, if he had physical attributes to be a great, cyclist, he would have excelled in that sport because he has that, that mental drive and those skills.
There's a couple of things here. Right. There's a couple of things here. There's a lovely bit of research called the tenacious brain. And what it's done is it's teased out a brain region which is called the anterior midcingulate. And that's the bit of the brain that does the weighing up. I want that, but I'm going to have to do this. Is it worth it? Yeah? Mm-hmm. So it's almost a bit of the brain that says, okay, Seb, you want to be a good cyclist, so you've got to go out and hurt yourself, over 6 hours a day, in the heat. Where you go. Okay, Rory, you want to be a good golfer? Yeah, that means you've got to go out and practice like this. That's fine. Okay, Wolfgang, you want to be a good pianist? That means you need to practice these. Now, and so it's that trade-off. So what that means is that the activity itself and what the activity brings needs to be important. I need to want this, and I invest myself and my time and my status and my reputation in that.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's it.
And finally, so from what you're saying, do you think athletes choose sports that fit their psychological tendencies, or does
I think they choose? Okay, I think it's right. There's a lovely word called biopsychosocial, right? Very good Scrabble score. But what it means is that things that happen to people, things that happen to humans are generally biopsychosocial. All right. So I went from 11 to 17 years and stone. So I was a pretty big unit. All right. So I was chucking out at local clubs at 15. You can't come in. I'm at school with you. All right, get in there and keep quiet. Okay. So biologically, I probably wasn't going to be a very good cross-country runner. Although, when I went into the military and had to do 80 miles a week in boots and pack, I got quite good at it. So there's a biological imperative. What do I like? There's a psychological imperative. How able am I to drive myself? How willing am I to put off feelings of success to achieve now? And socially, what's the context around me? You came up through a private school, public school in UK, where rowing was a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
You fell into rowing, yeah. When you came to Boston, you changed. That's okay. But the what made you ambitious and keen and drove you to be a rower was biopsychosocial. Now, biologically, it would have been much better if you'd been 6'4". And I know you got fed up with people looking at you and going, "Mate, you'd be a marvelous cyclist." Yeah. Yeah, but guess what? You are now.
Yeah.
A marvelous cyclist, right? So so just think of that biopsychosocial bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how it works.
When I started this conversation, I thought the answer might be simple. Endurance athletes must just be wired differently. Because from the outside, what we do looks strange. 5 hours on a bike, training at the edge of exhaustion, choosing discomfort over and over again. It's easy to look at that and say, those people must be a little bit mad. But Dave's research and the conversation I just had with him tells a more interesting story. As he explained, quoting Aldous Huxley, experience is not what happens to a person, it's what they do with what happens to them. Adversity by itself doesn't create excellence, because hardship alone doesn't guarantee learning. What matters is whether athletes have the psychological tools to interpret those experiences and grow from them. Dave calls these psychological characteristics of developing excellence, the PCDEs. Skills like self-regulation, reflection, and the ability to manage pressure and challenge productively. And what's fascinating is that these skills appear across sports. Endurance athletes, golfers, dancers, musicians, shot putters. The same psychological toolkit shows up again and again. It just looks different depending on the demand of the activity. Dave described it with a simple metaphor. Every athlete trains at the edge of a cliff. Push too far away and you fall. Don't push far enough and you never improve. For a cyclist, that edge might be 100 miles. For a golfer, it might be 100 swings. Different environments, but the same psychological balancing act. So maybe endurance athletes aren't fundamentally different at all. Maybe what looks like madness is really just practice. Practice at regulating discomfort. Practice at interpreting challenge. Practice at deciding day after day that what works is worth it. Because somewhere deep in the brain, in the system Dave described that weighs effort against reward, every athlete is asking the same question. Is it worth it? Is it worth the sacrifice? Is the suffering worth it? Am I good enough? And the athletes who make it, the cyclists, the golfers, the dancers, they're the ones who keep answering the same way, yes. Not because they're wired differently, because they've learned how to keep choosing it. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Sebastian Alls.